Well, good morning. Are we good? Are we ready to go?
Yeah, do you want me to do the introduction? Or?
I think you should do the introductions with the leadership, please.
All right, good morning, everybody. I just want to acknowledge that we're on the Algonquin and Anishinaabe territory. My name is Chair Francis. I'm the Press Secretary of the National Chief's Office. I'd like to formally introduce our speaker today for our press conference to discuss the First Nations Summit with the Prime Minister for the next 2 days. Our first speaker...
Opening prayer.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, as per our custom. Yeah. Cheyenne.
I'll pray in English so everyone will understand me. I ask Creator that you'll come here today and you'll bless our leadership, bless our national chief and all the chiefs that are behind her to lead our people in a good way and all of our people across Canada or North America. That you will bless all of our people and all our leadership to lead us in a good way and take care of all the chiefs wherever they go, and the ones that are coming, traveling here, that they will get here safely, and that when they go back home to their home fires, that you will bless them, Creator. Send the grandfathers down to take care of them and get home safely. I ask that today, Creator, and ask for good meetings and the chiefs be heard in English.
Thank you, Cheyenne. So I'd like to introduce our speakers here this morning. So our first speaker will be the Assembly of First Nations National Chief Cindy Woodhouse Nepinak. Our second speaker will be AFN BC Regional Chief Terry Teegee. Our third speaker will be Liz 10 First Nation Chief Ed John from Northern BC. Our fourth speaker will be Manitoba Keewatinowi Okimakanak Grand Chief Garrison Settee from Manitoba. We also have leadership standing behind our speakers here this morning, and we have some regional chiefs and we also have some rights holders. What I'll do is I'll quickly get them to introduce themselves.
Councillor Joan Salmon from Northwest National First Nation, Northern Manitoba.
Joanna Bernard, Regional Chief for New Brunswick at the AFN.
Good morning, Chief Elwood Zastri from Manitoba, from Musqueam First Nation, and also Grand Chief of Swampy Creek Tribal Council.
Good morning, Andrea Paul, Regional Chief for Nova Scotia.
Buju Mishkrab Ndijnikas Makwan Ndodam. Jeff Kopanis, the elected Chief of the Ojibwe Ziwanikamay.
Good morning, Wendell LeBeau for Regional Chief for Prince Edward Island.
Good morning, Chief Tamara Young of Pictou in Nova Scotia.
Good morning, Chief Ruben Gray from Musqueam Creek Nation, Manitoba.
All right, awesome, thank you. So we'll have a question and answer period after the speakers are done speaking, and also the leadership in the room here will be available to chat with reporters after the press conference. So thanks for attending today, and please welcome National Chief to the microphone.
Thank you. Thank you to the press for being here and walking with us as we get our messaging out this week. It's been, it's been a long time. I think the last meeting that Chiefs had with the Prime Minister was in 2012. And I think that that's too long for Canada to have a conversation with First Nations. And so we look to this week for a more firm commitment on meeting more regularly with our First Nations leadership across this country and with the country as a whole. I want to recognize the Algonquin and Anishinaabe territory on whose land we are on. Thank you to Cheyenne, our knowledge keeper, our young knowledge keeper, for your prayers. And again, thank you to the media for attending. Today, for the first time since being sworn into office, Prime Minister Carney will meet with First Nations chiefs from across this country. It has been over 13 years since a Prime Minister had convened a meeting directly with First Nations leadership. So we lift up chiefs that have traveled to be here this week. We also recognize chiefs that can't be here because they are fighting wildfires in this country. And our hearts and prayers are with all of you and with the first responders across this country. First Nations and Canada are once again at a critical point in our nation-to-nation relationship. We recognize the Prime Minister for hosting this meeting. I know that him and I had tough discussions on it, and I'm glad that he'd answered that call to meet with chiefs directly. And so I appreciate him for that. I want to start by saying that we stand with the Prime Minister and with all Canadians against Prime Minister Trump's illegal tariffs. From the War of 1812 and world wars thereafter, World War I and II, and throughout this country's history, First Nations in the masses and more than any other group, cultural group in this country, stood up for this country when they were facing war and times of crisis. Now is another one of those times, and First Nations are standing up again to protect their country. First Nations have inhabited these territories long before colonial borders were established. We have always supported economic growth and prosperity for all, but not at the expense of our rights and of the environment. Our rights cannot be implemented or respected without us in substance and in process. They cannot be respected after the fact. We have proven over and over in court and at the United Nations. Bill C-5 was introduced, and the Assembly of First Nations organized 2 virtual forums, and our executive, many who are here today, had met yesterday. These meetings were a chance to share strategies and discuss issues rights holders and First Nations have been raising. Consultation and consent were common themes. Chiefs have made it very clear that First Nations consent for major projects is not optional. Well, the bill was rammed through Parliament in 20 days and amended to require provincial consent for national projects. Provisions for the free, prior, and informed consent of impacted First Nations were voted down. Until an appropriate process founded in free, prior, and informed consent is established between First Nations rights holders and the Crown's legal obligations will not be met. So this week, my friends, is only the beginning. Our Assembly of First Nations virtual forums made it clear that First Nations have a range of views on major project development. This diversity is to be celebrated, not feared or leveraged against us. Many First Nations are very concerned about Bill C-5, while other chiefs want to proceed quickly with projects, resource revenue sharing agreements, and project ownership. We support every First Nations rights holder, whether they oppose or support this bill. During the forums, chiefs have questioned the federal definition of a national interest project. Why can't the construction and ongoing operation of a long-promised clean water systems in First Nations communities be a project of national significance? Why not fast-track First Nations infrastructure, quality housing, modern First Nations schools, and reliable internet access? Access to cell phone service for First Nations children and their families. Systemic neglect of basic infrastructure is another example of deep-rooted inequality that has led to poorer health outcomes and less prosperity for First Nations compared to that of other Canadians. We are 4 times more likely to live in a crowded house, 6 times more likely to live in a home that needs major repairs. Half of First Nations schools in Canada on our First Nations are overcrowded. They're in need of additions or immediate replacement. During this past federal election, Prime Minister Carney recognized this opportunity in a very tangible and relevant terms during a virtual forum with our chiefs. The Prime Minister said closing the First Nations infrastructure gap alone would have a bigger impact, economic impact, than the negative aspect of all of Trump's tariffs. In addition to a huge return on investment, he described the need to provide predictable funding through a single envelope. The Prime Minister said his government would match First Nations-led projects with financing certainty so projects can move through. Excuse me. Any moment. And during the royal visit, King Charles III said that we must honor the truth and reconciliation in both word and deed. With the election over, Trump's tariffs, and the next budget approaching, we have a chance to turn to the Prime Minister's insightful words to deed. What better way to recognize the 10th anniversary of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action than fast-tracking national projects to close the First Nations infrastructure gap? Rights holders have been waiting patiently to be heard about Bill C-5. They were purposely excluded and uninvited from any substantive exchange with parliamentarians about C-5. So this week, we hope space will finally be provided for chiefs to be heard. We hope the infrastructure gap is on the table in a very serious way. And we hope the Prime Minister will make meetings with rights holders a more regular occurrence. This can't just be the be-all, end-all today. This has to be the start of a new relationship with First Nations directly. Regardless of what happens, nothing will change the reality that over $560 billion of projects are forecast to be launched on traditional First Nations lands over the next decade. The potential benefit of these projects is in the trillions of dollars, but they're not going to advance without First Nations support, and that is the truth, my friends. Thank you so very much. Chimigwech.
Deneza Sekuza Skies. First of all, I want to acknowledge the unceded, unsurrendered, continued occupied territory of the Algonquin people, Anishinaabe people. Thank you for allowing us here. Thank you, National Chief, for opening comments, and Shan for the opening prayer. From a BC perspective, this is nothing new as we've dealt with Bill 14 and 15 in British Columbia, which is also fast-tracking legislation to approve projects. The issue with Bill C-5 and all those other bills, including Bill C-5, I believe here in the province of Ontario, is that they're already law. So where do we go from here? And that is one of the questions that we're really contemplating in BC, and also I would say overall in this country. Where do we go from here? That the commitments that we heard from the United Nations Declaration Act, from the National Action Plan that should be implemented, the development of legislation that was supposed to include First Nations were bypassed. And as the National Chief stated, free, prior, and informed consent needs to be upheld. Our rights can't take a back seat in terms of how decisions are made. And there have been long, hard-fought fights that we had in British Columbia, all the way from Calder, Sparrow, Delgamuukw, Stayaway to Chilcotin. And far too often, none of those court cases have been fully implemented. So we're here, and certainly we're looking to see that the United Nations Declaration is being upheld and implemented and fully implemented. Free, prior, and informed consent cannot be an afterthought. So our question is to Mr. Carney and to Prime Minister Carney, will you uphold free, prior, and informed consent? And as the discussions happen in the next couple of days, I think it's really important to build this relationship in a good way. And I think what we're trying to do here as First Nations is come to the table with solutions, with really, I think, options in terms of how best to move forward with this legislation. And perhaps, if there is an opportunity, to make amendments to the legislation. I think, moving forward, it's been far too long that we haven't met with a sitting Prime Minister. But I think about this, and I know we've been here before. And I know, in the 10 years that Harper was in power, that there was cuts to a lot of the funding to First Nations, that there was bill, I believe back then, C-45, that would have really put our rights in the back seat and not be upheld. We had to fight, and henceforth, the Idle No More movement. So it's nothing new to us, I suppose. But here, the next 2 days, I think, is a real opportunity to open dialogue and perhaps have solutions to move forward in a good way. So thank you, Masicho.
Next, I'd like to introduce Liston First Nation Chief Ed John from Northern BC.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I would like to acknowledge our faith keeper for the beautiful words. I'd like to acknowledge the elders who were here. I'd like to acknowledge the regional chiefs from the Atlantic and the other chiefs from other regions. It's good to see you here. I welcome also your presence as storytellers in this country. I really appreciate the words by Regional Chief Terry Teegee from British Columbia and the words of our national chief on a national basis that are so important. I am Edward John. I am from the northern part of British Columbia. I'm the elected chief. Of Glasgow Nation, we have 3 small communities, probably not more than 2,000 people altogether. But we've lived in the traditional territories. We live at the headwaters, the Mackenzie River, the Skeena River, which goes to the west, and the Fraser River, which goes to the south. We're a mineral-rich territory. What we see in front of us right now are an LNG pipeline being proposed. The proponent also includes Anishka Lissom's government. We have across the river from my village probably the largest critical mineral deposit, nickel. That's a rare mineral or critical mineral, and there's a lot of discussion and activity around that. We're not sure how, whether the federal legislation C-5 or the provincial legislation C-14 and 15, what impacts they will have. But what we do know is this, that there are standards, legal standards in this country, constitutional standards, and standards like the UN Declaration and Section 35, which have been interpreted by the courts, that rights in British Columbia, Aboriginal rights, Aboriginal title continue to exist, never have been extinguished. And those rights are, as the court said, legal rights with a beneficial interest in it, which means that we have a right to raise revenues on the resources. Our peoples have the right to make decisions in accordance with our teachings. And so this is the standard that we have. The standards federally and provincially, we know what those standards are. So how do we engage government? One of the flaws, I think, that we've seen is in Article 19 of the UN Declaration. I'm very familiar with the UN Declaration, having represented the Assembly of First Nations over many years in Geneva while the negotiations were being conducted, and in Geneva at the Human Rights Council when it was adopted on June 28, 2006, and then was sent to the General Assembly in 2006. It was delayed for a year, but it was adopted finally in September 13, 2007. And there are very important standards in the Declaration, which now, by law, by legislation in this country, federal legislation, the UN Declaration Act, provincially, and the same legislation or similar legislation in British Columbia, legislates the standards into law. The standards like free, prior, informed consent, the right to self-determination, the right to lands and territories and resources are already in international instruments and are part of the greater customary international law. They stand on their own, but they've been adopted here by legislation as well. Article 19 I was referring to, the first violation was the process for the bill. Article 19 is where any state is considering legislative or administrative measures that affect Indigenous peoples. The Indigenous peoples' free, prior, and informed consent is required. That didn't happen here. So there's a violation of federal law, and there's a violation of the standards of international law. And so anybody who may want to go to court, they have, I think, very solid foundations to consider that. Will the government change or amend C-5? Well, we'll see what happens over the course of the next 2 days. but the standard of consultation with Indigenous peoples and Indigenous governments is the same as a standard that applies to Quebec or British Columbia and Ottawa in their relationship. Those are constitutional in nature, and so are the relationships that we have. They're constitutional in nature by law itself, but through treaties as well. Many historic treaties, many modern agreements and treaties that set new forms of relationships. And those treaties are essential for Indigenous peoples. Treaties, agreements, and other constructive agreements in Article 37 of the United Nations Declaration to apply those. So having said that, this is not the first time we've been here. I was at the King's Throne speech here on May 27th, and I heard him say this in acknowledging the Algonquin Anishinaabe, and I wish to acknowledge that we are on their territory. When he acknowledged that, he went on to say that I'm very concerned about the relationship. You can read it yourself what he said, but he said it in a much better English than I will say it. That in acknowledging the Algonquin and Anishinaabe territory, he made the point that it is my great hope that in the communities across the country and collectively, that there's a path toward truth and reconciliation in word and in deed, a path toward. So the message is that we're still not in this place called reconciliation. We have a long ways to go. As I was sitting there, I was reminded of another king, King George III. In the Royal Proclamation of October 7th, 1763, he said this, that the Indian nations and tribes with whom we are connected are not to be molested or disturbed in the possession of their lands, which have not been sold or otherwise acquired by Crown interests. And that message over 260 years ago still resonates here. Why? I mean, notwithstanding all of the multiplicity of instruments that we have and laws, like the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals 2030, the climate agreement in Paris in 2015 under the former Prime Minister, all of those are solid international instruments, the recognition of Indigenous rights. So as I sit here as the elected chief and the rights holders of our nations, our people, we have three priorities. One of it is to deal with the severe social economic gaps that our peoples face, the infrastructure gaps that the national chief was talking about. Those gaps are serious on a day-to-day basis. Yesterday morning, before I left my community, we had over 150 to 200 young people who are in government, in government care from 4 communities in the surrounding area come to our village. And these kids are on the road to disconnections from their language, culture, families, communities, lands, territories, resources, everything that defines who they are. I couldn't help but think maybe we can help these young people continue to be who they are as Indigenous peoples. So that's an example of one of the objectives. The second one is, and that's a cumulative effects on people. The second is a cumulative effects on lands, territories, and resources, and it's extensive. In the northern part where I come from, I might as well be in Alberta or Saskatchewan because it's clear-cut throughout. The cumulative effects on that affects our food sovereignty, and yet at the same time there are mineral deposits that governments and proponents are interested in developing. There was a report done by the company, Economic Justification Report, Economic Impact Report. That project stands to raise $45 billion in 30 years. And I saw the breakdown so much. Part of course, a majority would go to the proponent, but a significant into the billions of dollars to the federal government, into the billions of dollars to the province, and into the hundreds of million dollars to municipalities and regional districts. There was not one line in the 33-page report about 1 cent going to our communities, to our people. Not one mention in the entire 33-page report about Indigenous peoples. In the maps that they introduced, there was not one of our village or communities identified. So I mean, when you feel invisible, that's what happens. These things happen. So when institutions or situations like this arise, the 1969 White Paper policy, lots of protests across this country. The 1982 constitutional amendments and a repatriation, there were court cases in London. There was a train that traveled across this country. And it goes on the more recent ones. And I think that the dialogue between governments and our peoples and our governments needs to be elevated. The last point I want to make, my colleague here, Regional Chief Terry Teegee, and the National Chief mentioned ongoing discussion. In British Columbia, some 10 years ago, I believe, we established an annual meeting between the Premier and the entire Cabinet with chiefs in British Columbia over 2 days. We discussed high-level political issues, and it has toned down the level of conflict. Not to say that there is no conflict. There is always conflict. But we're always looking and want to find solutions. And this is where I think we're at this kind of moment again now in 2025. There's always resolution. There's always solutions. There are many people who support the bill, and there are just as many people who object and do not support the bill and seek amendments. So where this country will head, tomorrow we'll decide that. Today and tomorrow, that decision of the Prime Minister and his cabinet is going to be important. True dialogue, hopefully, but the main question that I would have is that will they listen? Thank you.
So our fourth and final speaker will be MKO Grand Chief Garrison Settee from Manitoba.
Tansi, tutemak, nichisanak, nuagumaganak. The biscat now, kagino. I am privileged to be here on the unceded territory of the Algonquin Nations. I count it a privilege, and also want to acknowledge that the leaders behind me and the national chief, regional chiefs, we are here representing sovereign nations from our territories. And a certain act has brought us together at the nation's capital to address some very serious and critical concerns that our people have. Because we are rights holders that predate the Constitution of Canada, that predate European contact. Those are our inherent rights. The rights to sovereignty and self-determination, the rights to uphold our languages and our culture and our identity. And we are representatives not only of the people currently that exist in our nations, but we also have a responsibility to look at those that are unborn. We think of those people, and the decisions we make will impact them. I'm reminded of a quote by Sitting Bull when his lands, his territory were taken over aggressively. But after all of that happened, he sat down with his chiefs and said, let us put our minds together. Let's see what kind of future we can create for our children. And that's what we're doing here. What kind of future will we create for our children? As it exists, most of our First Nations have an 80% unemployment rate. Our graduation levels are very low. Our success rates of post-secondary is also low. So we have very important decisions to make. So this bill has prompted us to come here and to state unequivocally that our rights, our people, deserve to be protected, regardless of any legislation or policy that's been created. There is power in our inherent rights. There is power in our treaties, and we will ensure that they are respected. The erosion of free, prior, and informed consent is simply not acceptable. The duty to consult and accommodate is very important. In my territory, for years upon years, we've had corporations and governments coming into our territories to extract resources. Mining, forestry, hydroelectric projects, and they left our people in poverty while they made trillions of dollars, and our people still live in abject poverty. This is not acceptable. Going forward, nothing will happen in our territories without our people being involved and making decisions on behalf of their nations. Nothing can happen without a process where we have the maximum benefit of those resources that are being extracted or any projects that go through. Our people must be part of the process where there's revenue sharing, and that we can leave something for those that are yet unborn, that we can leave something for the future of our people. That's what we're concerned about. What kind of future are we going to leave for those children? And this bill will impact those decisions. They will impact our people. So we want to make sure that we are part of this process. Economic reconciliation is not just a buzzword. It's a reality that we want for our people. Nothing about us without us still rings true to our nations and our leaders. And we're here to ensure, going forward, our people must not be left out. Our people must be part of this grand scheme of prosperity. We cannot be left out, and we're here to assert that our people will not have to go through a process where they're left out again. And we're here to state that unequivocally. Ego sana again, ask it now. Hi.
Well, look, I'm going to probably ask one of the chiefs to speak at this. I think I want Jeff Kopanes to also say what he thinks, because I think it's important that the chiefs have their voices heard. They're on the ground. They know what they need. For sure, from the Assembly of First Nations, as you've heard in my speech, closing that First Nations infrastructure gap and a plan to do that. I know that there was a commitment from the previous government to close that to 2030. We're not on track for that. And you know, we have a $350 billion gap in infrastructure for First Nations kids in this country. And we think of all of our kids and our grandkids. And, you know, off reserve here, for instance, there's hospitals, there's good schools, there's parks, there's good roads that they can, have their school buses drive on. Or little kids in many of our First Nation communities need better roads. They have unpaved roads. Our children need more access to clean drinking water systems, infrastructure, housing. Their schools need to be modernized. We need to give these kids boots up and make sure that we're not having these same conversations 20 years from now. So we're looking to, a commitment from this government. What is the commitment to close that infrastructure gap? And I know they say, we want to talk, that's something else over there. It's not. You can't talk about big projects and trying to fix this country without fixing the basic infrastructure for First Nations children in this country. Our kids need a better life than all of us had. All of us grew up on reserve here. And we know the disparities that we have faced as children. Now we see it as grandparents to our grandchildren. We want a better life for our kids. But I do want to ask Chief Kopanes. I know he's a community chief. He's from Ontario, and yeah. What do you want?
Miigwech, National Chief, for this opportunity. Last night in the Ojibways of Onigaming First Nation, we lost another young person. I woke up this morning to news that we had lost another young person. It's the 46th death in 4 years in Onigaming. That's roughly 5% of our population. And we're really struggling right now. We have mining companies and exploration companies breathing down our necks, surrounding us. And we're not against development, but we have no ability to engage in good faith at this current time. And we are asking for Canada, as the National Chief has stated, to prioritize us. We're Canadians as well. We're Canadians as well. And we're losing our young people, especially at the fastest rates from addictions, but especially from suicides, from mental health issues, from addictions. And we need help, and we're begging for help. Unless Canada is able to, and they've said it before, they said it in the speech from the throne about free, prior, informed consent. So again, I'm not understanding why Canada can't ensure that this bill be amended to include free, prior, informed consent. All we are asking for, again, is to be at the table, that our voices be heard, and that we be prioritized. We want to build too. We want to build in Canada as well, but we want to build a youth crisis center. That's what we need. We need safe, sober beds. We need to build a youth multiplex center. We're not against the economy, but our young people want a Tim Hortons, and we want a store a brand new store in our community. We're not looking, again, to stop Canada from prosperity. We just want to share. We just want to be part of it. And again, I can't, echo the words from the National Chief and Grand Chief Settee loud enough. Please do not leave us behind. That is what we're asking for from this summit, is do not leave us behind. Miigwech.
Lady there in the black dress there.
Hi, National Chief. My question's for you, something here from National Post. What has been the answer you've received from the Prime Minister when you've asked, why not include First Nations infrastructure in the criteria for kind of quote-unquote national interest projects? And what risk do you think the government runs if it's not on the table tomorrow and going forward?
Look, I think, first of all, I know the conversations that, I haven't had a conversation with the Prime Minister for probably a month, I'd say, yeah. And when I told him he has to meet with chiefs, he's got to meet directly with chiefs. So I'm glad that he's meeting. Who also had to face this when it come to provincial territorial meetings with the Government of Canada, and they don't have a space for First Nations. The way that we govern in this country has to change. We don't need, I know Trump's at our borders pushing colonialism. We don't need more colonialism in our country. What we need is to get back to the table and to talk about these really hard things. I know they're uncomfortable truths, but they're the truth. We can ask our regional chiefs that are here, for instance, and the chiefs that are behind me about the gaps and the disparity on many of our First Nation communities. And that's why all of us do the work that we do. Nobody here ever retires. Why? Because there's always work to do. Because we see our little grandchildren or our children out there in our communities, and other people have play structures. Our children, far and few between. And it's not a question of if, it has to happen. And the government of Canada needs to come up with a plan. We've given them a plan. We've given them so much work on this. We'll continue as the Assembly of First Nations to push. They had a commitment to close the infrastructure gap to 2030. We need traction, and we need to see it on pen to paper with all of us agreeing to that, to close that gap. I think that's a start to this conversation. So we want to give them the benefit of the doubt that they come with something this week, because they can't come here and expect First Nations to accept the status quo any longer. We're tired of waiting. We've been pushing for a long time. We've done the legwork and the homework. All of you can review the Conference Board of Canada's report that we did jointly with the Assembly of First Nations on the infrastructure gap. I think we released 3 or 4 reports already, and it's huge, but it'll make a big difference in this country. It'll make a difference for all Canadians. There'll be, so much work and so much jobs created that it'll benefit everybody in this country. It's a good way forward. So I hope that they see the value in that and come to the table with proper solutions on closing the infrastructure gap. Thank you.
Is there any other questions? Well, let's go ahead.
Hi, National Chief Brent here from CBC Business. What do you make of the agenda? I hear it was released last night at 11:59 p.m. Are chiefs going to be able to be heard?
Well, I'm hoping they do. I think, the Assembly of First Nations was, we didn't co-develop this agenda with them at all. I'm glad that they've now put some chiefs. I've seen the first version and then the second version, and I'm sure it's still evolving, but I think, let's ask some chiefs that. What do they think of the agenda rather than ask me what I think of the agenda? So which chief is here? Chief Sastry.
Good afternoon, everybody. Chief Sastry from West Peak First Nation out of Manitoba. The agenda was very quick, just like the C-5 was given to us very fast and passed. Most of the chiefs in Manitoba will be attending this meeting. Also, we had a prior meeting to this. What we're worried about is we want to create jobs for our people. Bill C-5 went through already. But you got to understand, we're here to protect our waters, our trees. As you know, if you look in Alberta at the tar sands, how they're destroying all the earth. Global warming's coming up here. All our waters are down. So we're here to protect the water at no cost. If the government doesn't want to work with us, I think it will be another idle no more from our perspective. Thank you.
All right, I was going to go with her, and then I'll go with Alicia.
Hi, I'm Emily Haas from the Globe and Mail. I was speaking to a Grand Chief last week, and they kind of pointed out that they want to make sure that this consultation and this engagement is meaningful. Do you share that sentiment? How do you think the government can go about making sure that this is a meaningful day and not just where you share your thoughts and then nothing changes?
I'm going to ask one of my regional chiefs, I think, right, maybe regional chief, I'd like regional chiefs, both of my regional chiefs to please speak about this. Yeah.
Thank you. That question in reference to consultation, it kind of freaked me out a bit there, because this isn't consultation. They're coming in, they're putting up the agenda, they're deciding how this is going to proceed, but definitely it is not consultation. So please put that out there. It's very, very important. If it was, we wouldn't be here. We would be running the agenda, and this is not the case today. Thank you.
Chief Paul?
What was your question?
Sorry, looking at the engagement for, I do take the point that, that's complicated, and that's fine. But just how do you want to see it so that it is meaningful and that it things, yeah, I guess.
Okay. So Regional Chief Andrea Paul. So in order to make it meaningful, we have to be at the table. So we have to be able to co-develop agendas. We have to be given the proper funding so that if we are a consultant on projects, our communities are able to meaningfully engage. And that means give us the dollars so that our communities who don't have those dollars can go hire their lawyers, hire their technicians, hire their engineers, so that they can review what these projects entail. I was big on dealing with the pulp and paper industry in my community, and it was so important that if we were going to have meaningful consultation, one, they could not come to the table and say that this is confidential, because meaningful means I have to be able to go back, speak to the community, get their feedback, and come back to the table. That is really important. So when they say this is confidential, it cannot be that way, that we can't go back to our community members and have that discussion, because that creates mistrust with leadership. The other piece that needs to happen is we cannot be an afterthought. We have to be engaged right at the beginning, not when legislation is made and then come to us later with regards to what is happening, because then it makes it that we don't have that voice. And one of the big things for chiefs is they come with the voices of every single person from their communities. So when they're coming to these tables, they're the ones that have to speak and bring those issues forward, and it is so important for them. The other piece is they also come with the voices of those that don't have a voice. That is the water, that is the trees, that is the fish, that is the birds, that's everything that doesn't have a voice. That is what they come with. And that is what meaningful consultation to me would look like. So tomorrow, my hope is that the Prime Minister and his ministers will engage meaningfully with our rights holders, because the rights holders are carrying so much, because they're coming with the voices of every single person and every single living being. Walalio.
You know, we in Onegaming, we've been lucky to have the support of the National Chief. She's written us a letter, and we've been calling for a moratorium on development in our backyard, specifically exploration, specifically mining, but also the development of a nuclear repository for nuclear wastes. You know, for us, it's nearly impossible to come to the table in good faith. As chief, I play multiple roles, including pallbearer on a regular basis in Onegaming. And so I was just a pallbearer 2 weeks ago. And that's just the reality. Is the truth is that we don't have enough healthy young men in the community to serve those roles either. And to be able to ask me as chief to be able to ask our community for a proper consultation process with a mining company or exploration company. We just can't, because, we're planning on doing an event this Sunday and we're canceling again. Every time we try to hold an event or a consultation, it gets canceled because we have another wake and we have another funeral. And they're just constants. It's been one a month at least since I've been chief. And there's no end to it in sight. And so again, for those mining companies, we ask for their patience. For those exploration companies, we ask for their patience. I was recently the target of an exploration company which called me a bad chief because I told them that we weren't going to provide them with our consent to enter the territory, and he told me that I should resign, and that he blamed the deaths in the community on me. And that's just the reality that we face. If we're not part of the development, we get bullied, we get harassed, and there's a lot of money at stake. I understand that, but as Chief Ed John had shared, we're largely never really even a thought when it comes to sharing of those benefits or those resources. So there really needs to be a process put in place. It can't be rushed. And so all we're doing is begging, and not just Canada, Ontario, all First Nations, the Chiefs of Ontario, and the Assembly of First Nations, we're begging for help. We're just begging for any other community. If we're a community of non-Indigenous people, if we're a community of white people that had this much level of death, I think the rest of the country would come to our aid. But I don't see that. I don't see that happening today, and I think it's largely because we're First Nation. And so we've just begged for help, and we're begging for patience, and we're begging for support to come to a point in the time that we're able to lift our state of emergency, engage in these processes, and hopefully come to some agreement someday on mining. And again, maybe someday we will. But at this point in time, we're just not able to due to our state of emergency. Very good for the question.
All right, one last question. Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to circle back. You're indicating that you don't feel like you're able to engage in good faith. I'm just wondering, based on the interactions you've had with the Prime Minister's office in setting this up, and as you note that they've set the agenda here, you're getting the details kind of last minute. Do you think that the Prime Minister is coming into tomorrow's summit in good faith, or do you view this as him checking the box, as you said, for those on?
Look, I think we're going to give him the benefit of the doubt that he produces tomorrow. And I think chiefs, and I think that he has to also listen to First Nations leadership, more listening rather than talking about how they want to proceed forward. And I know they're a new young government, but at the same time, I think that if they want to walk through this together, it's hearing the voices of leadership on the ground. And you're going to hear tough stories like we just heard from Chief Copenas. Those are really hard to hear for this country, but they're the reality in communities. And then you hear some from more progressive, communities that are ready to go. We hear from them as well. I mean, I've had some chiefs call that they support this bill as well. Others that called that said that they don't support it. And I had one call yesterday and said, look, I'm so busy with ground level issues in my community, I don't know one way or another whether I support or I don't. So there's that conversation as well. And I think that these conversations should have happened before the passing of Bill C-5. And I've told them that in the Senate. I've told them that in Parliament. And I think, I felt for First Nations, but I also felt for Canadians, because I think Canadians as well need to be at the table sometimes to make bills stronger. And I don't think that we need to rush bills like this that are going to have major impact to our grandchildren when all of us, we're all getting mid-age in this room when we're not here anymore, that we leave good laws for this country. And I think when you rush things like this, you cause further friction and division and unknowns. And I don't think that we have to do that to each other as a country. So I'll hand it over to Regional Chief Teegee. Yeah.
I'm a bit more cynical. I do agree. I mean, just look at the process you've seen, we've witnessed with the last minute agendas and everything that has come about with this C-5 legislation. I think, if this is a success, I think it's getting a solid commitment from the Prime Minister of discussions of how free, prior, and informed consent will be implemented. And I think projects out there that have, I suppose that First Nations are favorable to C-5 and perhaps have projects in their own community, probably are going through a process of being approved anyways. The problem here is much similar in British Columbia and this bill, is that there are potentially going to be projects that are going to be very controversial. And it's those projects that I think the vast majority of chiefs are worried about. And, you know, if you have premiers like Daniel Smith really pushing for a northern pipeline in northern British Columbia, we know we've been down that road, and it's a very difficult situation where it's very difficult to get a approval from a project, a very linear project that has many First Nations need approval. So it really comes down to having a process that is recognizing our rights, title, and interest, and also our ability to approve these projects. As many of the chiefs said, you know, we're looking for equality and prosperity, and that's really what we're seeking. We'll see.
Thank you.
All right, that concludes our press conference. If you have any questions for the rights holders, they are available. Make themselves available. But I know Chief Cindy's got to go, so thanks everybody for your time today.
Thank you so very much for being here. Miigwech.